Hello, welcome to the Spotlight. I'm Papadopoulos. In as many times Israel has threatened Iran again. Iran's new Defense Minister, Brigadier General Mohammad Reza Qarai Ashtiani, has reacted strongly, vowing a crushing response to any imprudent move. Why has Israel's war of words against the Islamic Republic intensified in recent months? Well, in this edition of the Spotlight, we will look at the reasons behind Israeli threats and the double standard behind their accusations against Iran of pursuing nuclear weapons when the regime itself is sitting on more than 100 nuclear warheads at a minimum. First, let's cross on over to Ramallah to talk to Press TV correspondent Mona Kandil about the latest threats that are coming. We're looking at the increase, Mona, when it comes to the threats by Israeli officials against Iran. Perhaps you could name some of them. Go ahead, Mona.
Yes, that's right. Israeli officials' threats against Iran are not stopping. They are continuing. Israel's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Yair Lapid, was in a visit to Moscow, and after a meeting with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, he said that Iran and its nuclear capabilities pose a threat not only to Israel, but also to the whole world. He also tried to show that the whole world has a problem with Iran, not only Israel. And he said he's trying to incite against Iran, saying that the world must act in order to stop Iran from having nuclear capability. And if they don't do this, then Israel reserves the right to act. Before his statements, there were similar statements also from Israeli Minister of Military Affairs. Israeli Minister of Military Affairs Benny Gantz also said that he doesn't rule out the possibility that Israel will have to take action against Iran in the future in order to prevent a nuclear Iran. At the time, they are continuing their crimes and continuing to obtain more weapons from the whole world. They are threatening Iran to the extreme, maybe especially with the continuing and the renewed threats coming from different Israeli political officials.
Thank you very much for that. Mona Kandil from occupied Ramallah. Let me bring our guest for this edition of the Spotlight. We have author and former U.S. diplomat Michael Springman, who joins us from Washington. Also joining us, historian, analyst, and author Marcus Papadopoulos, who joins us from London. Okay, I'm going to start with you first, Michael Springman, if I may, going with what our correspondent there said. The most recent Israeli threat, and I'm going to quote how Yair Lapid, who went to Moscow earlier this month, said the following: "The world needs to stop Iran from getting a nuclear capability, no matter the price." And he added, "If the world doesn't do it, Israel reserves the right to act." What do you think he means?
Well, he means that he will... Israel, the apartheid entity, will act against Iran with the support of the United States and attack any nuclear installations or any nuclear scientists that it deems will be necessary to put an end to the imaginary Iranian nuclear program. Iran is enriching uranium to a limited extent. As a result of the Americans breaking the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And somehow the Americans and their Israeli masters are focused on this in order to divert attention from the colossal number of atomic bombs the Americans have and the outrageous number that the Israelis have. 100, 200, as many as the British do, 300 or 400. Nobody seems to know. And of course, as long as they keep talking about Iran and Iran's nuclear program and Iran's nuclear weapons that don't exist except in the Israeli mind, if they have a mind, it's going to be more of the same. The best offense is the best defense is a good offense. And the Israelis keep pushing this, and the Israelis in the news media around the world keep doing the same. So you hear only one side of the story. You hear only one bit of propaganda, Hezbollah explaining that the Israelis are so good at it.
We're going to talk about some of the other threats that Israel has made against Iran, Marcus Papadopoulos, but basically it appears that in recent months Israel's war of wars against Iran has escalated in terms of its threats. At least that's the impression that we have based on the number of threats that is leveled against Iran. Why do you think that it's on the increase?
Well, such is the temerity of the Israeli authorities that they never fail to provoke the ire of right-thinking people across the world. Because here we have Israel, a member of the United Nations, routinely threatening another member of the United Nations, in this case, Iran. Such disgusting, despicable behaviour runs contrary to the very essence of the United Nations. Indeed, in an ideal world, Israel, along with its patrons, America and Britain, would be expelled from the UN, but alas, the ideal is not always attainable, and in this case, there is no chance, of course, of Israel or America or Britain being expelled from the United Nations. But it is certainly the case that over the last few months, the threats stemming from Tel Aviv, the tirades of abuse emanating from Tel Aviv against Iran has increased. And whilst there is nothing new to this verbal abuse from Israel and from the threatening language from Israel, whilst it cannot be discounted, on the other hand, I don't believe there's anything for the Iranian government to be unduly concerned about, because it is my submission that Israel is, to put it simply, desperate. Israel understands that Iran is a very strong country with very strong friends and allies in the world. Iran, for instance, has a strategic partnership with Russia. Iran has very close relations with China. The Israelis are also aware that America does not want to become embroiled in a war with Iran. So it is certainly the case that there is no public will or mood in America for a war with Iran. So the Israelis, in my opinion, are desperate. And I would also add as well how ironic, how laughable it is for Israel, a country which has nuclear weapons and which refuses to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, is arguing that if Iran develops nuclear weapons, which the Iranian government has no intention of doing, then Tel Aviv will take action against Iran. It is really quite breathtaking, the audacity of the Israelis. But then Israel is the main conduit for American and British power in the Middle East. Therefore, the American and British establishments, the politicians and the mainstream journalists allow Israel to get away with whatever it wants, no matter how dangerous and how destabilizing a force Israel is in the Middle East and in the wider world. All that matters to the Americans and the British is that Israel ensures Western supremacy in the Middle East.
Okay. Iran has also said, Michael Springman, that Israel is desperate. But I'd like to zoom in on what Iran's new defense minister has said. General Mohammad Reza Ashtiani, about the threats leveled against Iran. He said the enemies of the Iranian nation will definitely receive a crushing response for any imprudent and reckless action that will incur heavy costs. And within that, he also said new technologies and domestic innovations are meant to ensure national security and to respond to any external aggression. Aside from the fact that Israeli threats are against international law, what is your view about the way that Iran has reacted in terms of the rebuttal or their reaction to Israeli threats?
Well, Iran's reaction and its public statements about these maniacal Israeli threats has been remarkably restrained and limited, and not engage in hyperbole of any kind so much as the Israelis do. It's very clear that when I was in Iran 3.5 years ago, I spoke with a well-connected individual who said that Iran knows exactly what the Israelis and the Americans are doing. And the Israelis and the Americans know Iran's strength, but because of their overweening arrogance, they persist in their threats against Iran, against the United Nations Charter, Article 2. And I think also the man told me that Iran would most likely have a limited response to any provocation or attacks, and it would escalate attacks on Israel and the United States as they escalated their attacks on Iran. And he said ultimately, in the end, they would target the heavily Zionist populations, centers of Israel. And of course, the Americans have all these hostages in the region. 10,000 servicemen at Al-Udeid Air Base in Qatar, 20,000 sailors and Marines in the Fifth Fleet steaming up and down the Persian Gulf, and in Manama, the capital of the repressive and repulsive country, if you can call it that, of Bahrain. So I think on the whole, Iran has been astonishingly restrained in its responses and lets the words speak for themselves.
Well, this is what then confuses this scenario, Marcus Papadopoulos, when it comes to the one that's leveling these threats, namely Israel. You're looking at a regime of which they recently assassinated an Iranian nuclear scientist using the most recent report indicating they used AI. And some Israeli officials have even bragged about the fact that this operation was carried out. And when you take a look at the response, it's barely there, if any, from the international community, if you want to call it that. You're looking at, again, a regime that's sitting on a pile of nuclear warheads, a regime that has carried out assassinations not only within Iran on a number of occasions, but also in other parts of the world. Not a very positive report card. So why is Iran the bad guy, and yet Israel is the one that can go around doing what it's doing?
Well, when we hear the term international community, we are not, of course, referring to the United Nations. No, the international community really refers to Western powers, America, Britain, Canada, France, and Germany. That is who the international community is. And as to why Iran is the country which is vilified, despite the fact that Iran has not attacked another country in modern times, and despite the fact that Iran does not violate the sovereignty of other countries, unlike for Israel, all comes down to the fact that Iran is a strategic partner of Russia's. Iran is the linchpin in the resistance movement to Israeli aggression in the Middle East. And of course, Israel and of course Iran pursues an independent foreign policy and does not submit to the threats and diktats emanating from Washington. And on top of that is the fact that Iran is located in a geostrategic part of the world. Iran's geostrategic importance is absolutely enormous, because if Iran was pursuing an independent foreign policy in an obscure part of the world, then we would not have witnessed the vilification of Iran and the Iranian people by the West that we have witnessed for some 42 years now. It is all because Iran is in a geostrategic part of the world. Iran opposes America, Iran opposes Israel, and that is why Iran is targeted by the West and, of course, Israel. And when it comes to the United Nations, regrettably, many of the bodies which comprise the United Nations have fallen under the influence of the Americans and the British. And as a result of that, those bodies rarely, if ever, castigate Israel, even though Israel feels so emboldened in this day and age,
well, that's the problem,
that it makes its threats public against any country in the world, such as Syria and Iran.
Well, that's the problem. Israel has become emboldened, but it's been carrying that type of posture, Michael Springman, because it's been allowed to do what it has been doing. It's broken the most UN resolutions, and the rap lists that I mentioned are missing a few other violations that Israel has occurred, even though it hasn't claimed responsibility, but Iran's nuclear facilities have come under attack. We could also talk about the way that Israel obviously violates the rights of Palestinians. That's another crime that's been going on for quite some time. What else can I tell you about Israel in terms of what it's done? We mentioned the assassination of Iran's nuclear scientists. So it reaches a point where Iran, could react to what Israel is saying. The other thing I wanted to mention was how Israel is attacking Syria for what, 2 or 3 years now at this point, continuously. So here you have this regime that is capable of carrying out military action. When is that threshold going to pass for Iran, do you think? I mean, where do you think that red line is going to cross?
Well, I think the red line is basically the control of the Western news media by Zionists. I read an article, admittedly it was an old one, recently by Philip Weiss of the website Mondo Weiss, and he said that just about everywhere he worked, in newspapers and in magazines, the people running the show, the editors, the managing editors, and you name it, farther up the line, were all Jews and were all Zionists and all supported Israel. The red line, of course, is when it gets to the point where these people can't support Israel anymore, and I don't think that's going to happen. They will do this no matter what. And as Hafsa Kara Mustafa said just the other day in another edition of Spotlight, the Western media and the Western governments cannot stand to see a powerful Muslim nation defying the Western view of how things should be and Western control of their internal politics, of their internal economies. And as long as these countries, such as Iran, are opposed to this, they will be targeted by the Western media and by the Western governments. So I think the red line really is wherever they want to put it, and if they can get away with destroying Iran, they will try, but it will come at a tremendous price. And the Americans still don't realize that Israel is their oldest enemy and greatest debtor. They went back in 1954 and burned U.S. Information Service offices in Egypt, burned the American consulate in Alexandria. They destroyed the USS Liberty, a national security agency signals intelligence ship. And you've had people blinded by folks demonstrating against the attacks on the Palestinian supply convoys led by the Mavi Marmara. Right. So the Americans will take it and let the Israelis kill them and steal their money and don't care about the rest of the world, let alone Iran. So sure. I think that there's no real red line there. Well,
the thing that also is perplexing, I know you have a reaction there, but I'd like to ask this question from you, Marcus Papadopoulos, if I may, because it always is somewhat of a mystery here. And Israel has said on many occasions throughout the past years, and during previous U.S. administrations headed by different U.S. presidents, that if the U.S., I mean, going back at least as far as Barack Obama, that if the U.S. does not do something about Iran, that Israel will go ahead anyways, with or without the U.S. support, and attack Iran. How true do you think that is?
Well, if Israel is meaning that it would carry out a surprise air raid over the skies of Iran, targeting sensitive Iranian military installations, then yes, I believe that is very possible, and I think that is well within the means of the Israelis. If, of course, the Israelis are talking about conducting a sustained military offensive against Iran, then I find that very difficult to believe that the Israelis would venture down that road, so to speak, because there is an enormous distance separating Israel and Iran. They are not borders. They are not neighbours. And therein would pose a logistical nightmare for the Israelis if they were intent on conducting a sustained military operation against Iran. But, as I said moments ago, if they are talking about carrying out surprise air raids against Iran, then yes, that is possible. But allow me to shed another dimension to Israel. During the conflict in Syria, Israel publicly, openly treated Al-Qaeda fighters who had been wounded in battle against the Syrian army. And let us not forget that Al-Qaeda was responsible for the massacring of civilians in New York, in Washington, in Madrid, in London, in Bali, and so on and so on. And yet here we have Israel treating wounded Al-Qaeda fighters in Israeli hospitals. But then that should not come as a surprise, because as a former director of Mossad said only a few years ago, Al-Qaeda is not an enemy of Israel's. And we also know that Al-Qaeda has never once threatened to attack Israel. Indeed, Al-Qaeda has never used any profanities, has never used any denigrating language about Israel. So it is very clear that there is an unofficial alliance between Israel and Al-Qaeda, as there is an unofficial alliance between the Americans and the British and Al-Qaeda.
Final question goes to you, Michael Springman. All of this is happening in terms of the threats, at least the most recent ones by Israel against Iran, during the time that at this point nuclear talks, if they are going to be continuing, that it's still something that's alive, even though it's on life support. And many are saying that, you know, Israel is trying to make sure that the U.S. does not succumb and bring Iran back to the table and have a deal made. Do you think that that is the intent that Israel has?
Well, Israel, yes, certainly doesn't want a deal, because they want to keep pointing the finger at the wicked and evil Iran that is supposedly developing all these nuclear weapons and in fact isn't. So the Israelis don't want a deal. The American government, with Joe Biden and his Zionist State Department and CIA and Director of National Security, are all opposed to Iran. They keep putting condition after condition up there, insisting that Iran submit to controls on its missiles, that Iran submit to the range of its missiles, that Iran stop supplying fuel to Lebanon, which no other country is doing so far. They're doing their best to alleviate the suffering of the Lebanese people. They support Syria and the attempts of the Americans and the Israelis to destroy that government. So it's basically, yes, Israel does not want a renewed joint comprehensive plan of action. And I think that if that happened, then people might start asking, well, why doesn't something like this apply to Israel with its hundreds of atomic bombs, great amounts of poison gas, and vast amounts of deadly bacteria?
Thank you very much for that. Unfortunately, we're fresh out of time. But let me thank our guest, author and former U.S. diplomat Michael Springman there. Thank you for your comments. Marcus Papadopoulos, thank you, historian, analyst, and author there from London. And at the top of the spotlight, we had Mona Kandil, correspondent from Ramallah. And with that, we come to an end for this edition of the Spotlight. Thanks for tuning in. From me, the entire team is goodbye. Until next time.